Earlier this month, the Korea Disease Control and Prevention Agency launched a special committee assigned with the task of comprehensive research into reports of adverse reactions to COVID-19 vaccinations. For more, I have Dr. Park Byung-ju, who is in charge of this special committee called the Vaccine Safety Committee. It's a pleasure to have you here, Dr. Park.
Hi.
I also have Professor Justin Fenders at Dongseul University over in Busan joining us live via Skype. Professor Fenders, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
Right, we'll start here in the studio. Dr. Park, let's start with a few words then about the newly launched Vaccine Safety Committee, and perhaps do tell us a bit about how its role differs from the existing Vaccine Injuries Investigation Committee.
Yes. The mission of the new committee is to produce scientific evidence on causal relationship between COVID-19 vaccine and suspected adverse reactions. The committee has three subcommittees, which are Epidemiology Subcommittee, Clinical Subcommittee, and Communication Subcommittee. The difference between the Vaccine Compensation Committee and ours is target for causality evaluation. Compensation Committee has been evaluating causality between vaccine and suspected adverse reaction based on individual case information. But our committee will evaluate the causality based on population data. That's the difference.
Right, so it's much more comprehensive then. Professor Fenders, it has been said that proving a link between an adverse reaction and vaccination is extremely challenging. Could you explain this reality for us?
Sure. So from a purely scientific perspective, there are two main criteria, basic criteria that are used to make this assessment. The first is propinquity, and the second is the frequency in which you observe these events. So propinquity describes the shortness of time between the moment that I receive vaccination and the time that I observe some kind of an adverse effect. So if I get vaccinated today and I have a really severe headache a year from now, it's very difficult to make the claim that those two events are related. However, if I get that same headache within 3 hours after vaccination or tomorrow, then that becomes a stronger case that perhaps the vaccination was causing that particular adverse event. The second aspect, the frequency or the consistency of the observation, that has to do with how often we observe these two things being connected. So if we go out and we vaccinate 1 million people and only one of them has a headache after vaccination, again, there too, it's difficult to make the case that the vaccine caused the headache. But after vaccinating 1 million people, if we have 100,000 or even 1,000, then that starts to develop some kind of base of evidence where you can say that one thing is causing the other. And from a purely scientific perspective, the degree of relationship, the number of times we observe this, the frequency or the rate, allows scientists to then give these observations different categorizations. So if 10% of the population gets these adverse effects, then we could say that that's a very common side effect. If it's only 1% or less, then we can categorize it as rare or very rare. So from the purely scientific perspective, that's kind of the way that we look at things. When you add on the legal layer, especially when we're talking about compensation, the next thing that comes into play is something called provable injury. So this is the degree to which someone has an adverse effect and they are damaged in some fashion by it. So if I'm vaccinated today and then I have really severe heart symptoms and I'm hospitalized for 3 days, then that unexpected hospital bill would be an example of a provable injury. Also, if I missed work for 3 days and so I wasn't able to collect my normal wages, that also would be a provable injury. And depending on whether my symptom is one of those common or rare or very rare categories, that then allows me in a legal sense to try to make a petition to say, hey, the vaccine caused me these difficulties, and so I should be legally compensated in some financial fashion.
Right. And talking about compensation, Dr. Park, what can you tell us about the compensation efforts here in the country for those who have experienced adverse reactions to COVID-19 vaccinations?
Yeah, we have already a Vaccine Compensation Committee for a long time. So Vaccine Compensation Committee evaluated 1,551 adverse event cases submitted from February to July this year. According to compensation money amount, the criteria was 300,000 Korean won. So less than 300,000 won there have been 1,288 cases. Among them, 73%, 935 cases were compensated. But those with more than 300,000 Korean won, 263 cases, only 18%, 48 cases have been received compensation. So there's a big difference.
Right.
According to time interval, from vaccination to symptom occurrence, 47% were less than 24 hours, and 17% were from 1 day to 3 days. And only one case, 0.06%, was from 4 to 7 days. So it means that almost all of the cases were very short time period of symptom occurrence. That is acute adverse event. But our government is not deal with the chronic adverse events yet. That's the problem, I think. And according to diagnostic criteria, 63% were general symptom like fever, and 15% were neuropsychiatric symptoms, and 6.7% were gastrointestinal symptoms, and 6% were allergic reactions, and 5.5% were musculoskeletal symptoms, and 2.1% were local reactions like pain at injection site, and 1.2% were anaphylaxis.
Right. Pain at the injection site, though, is a rather mild symptom of the vaccination,
Yes,
right?
localized and mild.
Right. Dr. Park, do correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand that previously authorities here turned to research overseas to help them guide through whether this particular adverse reaction is caused by a vaccine. So they turn to research overseas. How will your new committee seek to tackle the task of determining a link between vaccination and a post-inoculation adverse reaction?
Yes. Previous, I said our committee deal with the population data. So we are going to use the vaccinees information and reported adverse events from the Korea Disease Control and Prevention Agency, and then health, medical insurance claims data from National Health Insurance Service, and mortality data from Statistics Korea. Our committee will calculate the incidence rate and mortality rate of suspected adverse events, and then we are going to conduct well-designed pharmacoepidemiologic research to evaluate causality scientifically by record linkage study with using all these sources of data.
I see. That is good to know. Now, for the sake of comparison, we turn to Australia, where over 10,000 people have registered for a government program that seeks to compensate those who endured health issues after COVID-19 inoculation. For more, I have Dr. Mukesh Haikawal live on the line. Dr. Haikawal, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Good evening.
Dr. Haikawal, you are most welcome. Do tell us a bit about the vaccination rate in Australia and the reported cases of adverse reactions there.
Well, our vaccination started in February, and in March went from beyond the hospital vaccinating hubs to general practice, where most people get their vaccinations done for everything else. We started off with AstraZeneca in general practice, and we didn't get Pfizer for some months later on. The problem we had, of course, with AstraZeneca was people started getting blood clots. Very few, by the way, but still people were getting blood clots. And the concern of that became massive. And we, as the medical profession, the Medical Association, the College of GPs and the General Practice Alliance, very clearly said that you need to make people understand that these side effects are very rare, but if you do get them, the government, who's actually paying for the vaccine, who's paying for the scheme, who's actually indemnified the manufacturers, should actually bring in a no-fault compensation scheme. So if somebody does have an adverse reaction, they should be able to get compensation for that adverse reaction without having to go to courts. because without a no-fault compensation scheme, the only way this could be redressed was to sue whoever did the vaccination, which was generally the doctor. It could be the hospital that did the vaccine, but the manufacturers were actually not going to have to be part of that legal action. So it took until June for an announcement to be made for the no-fault compensation scheme, and it's really come into being only very recently. People are still not sure what happens if their claims are beyond $20,000, but there's supposed to be a scheme to look after them. And so what's happened is that of the 17 million people who've had vaccines now, about 10,000 have registered so far to potentially put a claim in, and that represents about 0.06% of all the people vaccinated. There have been adverse reactions, and you've had very good commentary about what that could look like, from very mild to very serious. And obviously it needs to be properly assessed as to the, and I like that word that you used there, the provable injury. And that's really the key to all of this, I suppose. But at least we have a scheme, and it meant that people were then comfortable to provide the vaccinations to the patients who had to be initially over 50 and then over 60 to get AstraZeneca, but we didn't have enough AstraZeneca to give the younger people. And when Pfizer started coming through, we couldn't give it to people who were under 40 because of the lack of access. So we had to make it something that a younger person could have, and a doctor would be prepared to give a younger person, as long as they were compensated for and didn't have to take all the financial and legal risk on the professional themselves doing the vaccination. So it made sense for this to happen, that the government said, we believe the vaccine is safe. We believe there's going to be very little side effects, proper problem. And if you do get them, we've got your back as a patient, citizen, getting the vaccine if it goes wrong. And you, the doctor, can keep giving them because we've got your back as well. So it's a very important scheme to bring some surety back to giving AstraZeneca. And of course, we've now gone, and there's much more Pfizer available. We've also got Moderna now. We only have 3 vaccines here. And of course, we've got to the situation where we can give people whichever vaccine they want.
Right. And very briefly speaking, Dr. Haikawal, what can you tell us about the procedure to assess a link between the vaccination and certain adverse reactions?
At this stage, the scheme has got to the stage of announcing that it exists and asking people to express their wish to be part of it. There will be committees like your own being formed here, but at this moment they have not been set up, and actually the criteria are still being developed. And I think this will be an international, global way of doing this, using UN criteria. We have a Murdoch Children's Research Institute, which is my go-to resource for anything to do with COVID vaccination, and that accumulates all of the data and all of the potential problems you can get with each of the vaccines and the benefits of the vaccines. Remembering that if you didn't get vaccinated and you got COVID, that's pretty serious, potentially lethal. And of course, people who have got COVID and recovered can have something called long COVID as well, which is also pretty horrible to have as well. So there's both sides to that issue about vaccinations and side effects compared to actually getting the infection, which is a big problem, of course.
Right. And before we go any further, Professor Fendos, I speak as a layperson. For the sake of clarity, what can you tell us about the possibility of race-related differences with regard to post-inoculation adverse reactions?
So it turns out that the idea that race can create differences in outcome or differences in result for medication or vaccine is a relatively new idea. I think we've only really taken it very seriously maybe for the last 20 years or so. And when you look at the data, there's not a whole lot of it. But we have seen some cases when it comes to medication where race can make a very big difference in very specific situations. But generally speaking, it looks so far that race ethnic categories don't make that big of a difference for medication or for vaccines. So when it comes to vaccines, the best piece of data I've seen was about human papillomavirus vaccine, HPV, the vaccine normally given to young women. A study done in the United States by the University of Pennsylvania showed that non-Latino white women were more likely to get migraine headaches as a side effect. But the general trend so far in the literature and in the data is that the differences in the side effects are not that large. and also that the side effects themselves, the severity of them also is not that different. When it comes to COVID vaccines, it gets a little more complicated because we have so many different kinds of vaccines. So it's much more difficult to go through the data. And also, having a really good experiment to test the idea of whether race makes a difference can also be problematic many times, because you can't just take Russian Caucasians and Asian Chinese and compare them, because there are many other things between those two groups that are different. So for instance, the lifestyle is different, the climate is different, the food is different. So the ideal kind of experiments that you want to do are where you have different ethnic groups living in the same city, for instance. And those kinds of data sets are kind of difficult to come by. But one thing is for sure, which is that it seems like for the COVID-19 vaccines that we don't see very large differences in outcome between ethnic groups, because just given the sheer number of people who've been vaccinated, if there were large differences in there, we would have seen them already. So there probably are some small differences in there, but there are not going to be any significant large ones.
Right. Meanwhile, back on the local front, Dr. Park, does the presence of your committee, that is, signal the possibility of perhaps changes in previous causality assessments of reported adverse cases by the KDCA?
Yeah, I think it will be possible. Especially some of the reserved decision-making cases due to lack of currently published scientific evidence. But our committee produced the scientific evidence by using Korean data. So the result can be used to decide to have positive causal relationship for the reserved cases. So we'll try.
Right, I see. That is good to know also. Back in Australia, Dr. Hai Kawal, I believe thousands of protesters took to the streets this past weekend denouncing COVID-19 vaccinations. What would you say is fueling these rallies, and what do you propose in response?
It's a mixed bag of what they're protesting against. So in my state, which is Victoria, and my capital city of my state, Melbourne, was declared the most locked-down city in the world before we started easing our restrictions about 2 weeks ago, and even more so last week. So there's new laws being brought in about pandemic laws. That's part of the protest. There's issues about mandating people having to go and get a vaccine to get to work, or to go to school, or to work in certain professions, and that people are protesting against that. And it's not necessarily about the vaccine itself. Many people are happy to have the vaccine, they just don't want to be told what to do. So I think we've even seen the Prime Minister talking about the government stopping telling people what to do all the time, whereas the state premiers have actually managed to get people to a situation where we can break down the lockdown and make people get back to work and out of masks again, because they've had vaccinations available and because the uptake was good. But it took a long time to get to the uptake to be so high, and it meant we had to have supply. And there was the mandating made people think that they had to do it, and in fact, it was good. My personal feeling is people should be given all the information to make the right choices for their own, to make that choice to get the vaccine, because it's the right thing to do, the safest thing to do for themselves, their family, and everybody around them. So a lot of these things have got mixed one into the other. I think that the protest, the biggest concern is about the new legislation here in Victoria, but certainly in other states, people are protesting being mandated to have the vaccine. The vaccine hesitancy is more, we had problems about supply, we had problems about worry about vaccine side effects, we had other issues that people were worried about. The main thing is people just don't want to be told what to do. And I think the main push is about getting good information. And of course, in Australia, it's a very multicultural society with, in my suburb around here, 135 different nationalities. So getting information people can understand in language, on video, on tapes, so they can actually make the right decision based on good information and not just media hype, which is causing them to be unnecessarily concerned. The level of vaccination side effects have been very tiny, and the benefits have been massive. The number of people going to hospital, going on to intensive care, being on a ventilator has dropped right down to next to very, very small numbers a day now.
Right. Professor Fendo, staying with vaccinations, here in Korea, vaccinations among teenagers have yet to gather momentum amid concerns, of course, over possible physical repercussions. Do you suppose an active compensation campaign and perhaps related treatment efforts would serve to boost inoculations among the teenagers here in the country?
So I think first for the international audiences, it's important to note that Koreans don't become legal adults until age 19. And so that means that the vast majority of Korean teens are actually minors. And even when they hit age 19, chances are they're still living with their parents and probably still doing some things that their parents tell them to do. So even though they're not minors technically, they're probably behaving like minors. So when it comes to teens getting vaccinated in Korea, you kind of have to consider both groups that are involved in the decision making, the teens themselves, as well as their parents and guardians. And I think the challenges on either side are slightly different. So on the teen end of things, I think most teens have already either seen or heard or even know of someone or know someone who knows someone who's gotten tested positive, gone into quarantine, but not shown any symptoms in their age group. So I think the prevailing understanding among teens is that, it's not as dangerous for me as it is for elderly, and so I don't have to worry as much about this. And that's a pretty serious obstacle to overcome if you're trying to convince them to do something, because to them it might not feel very necessary. On the parents' end, it's probably a combination of that also with the strong parental instinct. So parents, they're trying to make a value judgment based on the balance of potential risk with potential benefit. And they're probably seeing the same thing, that most teens, most young people don't seem to have much trouble. And so they're hesitant to put something that seems foreign into the bodies of their children when it doesn't feel like it's necessary. Now, I'm sure other guests on your program have said this, but the real issue with teen vaccination is not about protecting the teens per se. Obviously, that's a good effect. But it's also about trying to protect people that the teens might come in contact with and to whom the teens might spread the virus. And so this is really still, even a year on now, it's really about protecting someone else's grandmother or your grandmother more than it is protecting the teens themselves. And so I wonder if one of the pieces of public relations work, one of the images that's not being pushed enough is this reality that, we understand that that you probably don't need the vaccine, but you're not doing this for yourself, you're doing it for someone else. And obviously in a lot of Western countries, you might not hold a lot of hope that this works because, Westerners, for whatever reason, have been very reluctant to put down their own personal freedoms, to do a small thing that might be relatively inconvenient to save someone else's life. But I think in Korea, you might get a little bit more push with that. And so short of there being some new highly virulent variant of the virus that infects teens at a high rate, that forces them to change that mentality of, this doesn't have a whole lot to do with me, I don't see a lot of other courses that you could use to tip the scale in favor of convincing them to get vaccinated.
Right.
So pushing this idea, I think, is very important.
Right. I think the word that Dr. Haikawal used in another interview was the word goodwill, a sense of goodwill among the people to partake in the vaccination campaign. All right, Professor Fenders, thank you very much for your thoughts. Dr. Haikawal over in Australia, thank you very much for your time and your insight. And Dr. Park here in the studio, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much.